I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organizations.
The palace did not expect the decision to come so suddenly, and it certainly did not expect it to come with such finality. In one private confirmation, King Charles changed the emotional balance of the family forever, naming Princess Anne as the sole heir to Prince Philip's private estate. What had been whispered behind closed doors was now sealed by the monarch himself, leaving the royal household stunned, divided, and quietly afraid. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the moment he placed his hand on that confirmation that nothing inside the family would feel the same again. He had signed many papers as king, but this one carried the weight of a son obeying a father, not simply a monarch handling royal business. The private estate meant the personal property, papers, keepsakes, and protected holdings Prince Philip had kept outside the usual palace machinery. It was not just money. It was memory. It was judgment. It was the last quiet map of who Philip trusted when the doors were closed and the titles no longer mattered. Anne received the confirmation without a smile. She did not lean back in relief. She did not ask what others would say. She folded her hands tightly in front of her, as if trying to steady the burden before it fully landed on her shoulders. Charles watched his sister carefully, and for a brief moment, the king seemed less like a ruler and more like a man handing over a piece of their father that could never be replaced. Anne understood the meaning immediately. This was not a prize. This was a command. The signed confirmation changed more than inheritance. It removed every possible argument. Philip's private papers, his personal possessions, and the protected family holdings tied to his name would pass to Anne alone. The phrase, sole heir, meant only one person would inherit control, with no shared family vote, and no quiet rearrangement afterward. That detail hit the palace like a locked door. Several senior royals had expected division, compromise, some careful arrangement designed to keep everyone calm. Charles chose finality instead. A private courtier noticed the line that made the room colder. Anne's control was final, personal, and not subject to family review. The courtier read it once, then again, and the meaning became impossible to soften. No one could appeal to emotion. No one could ask for a private exception. No one could claim palace tradition as a way around the king's decision. Charles had not simply confirmed Anne. He had shielded her authority from everyone who might try to weaken it. The news moved quickly, but not loudly. A door closed. A message was passed. A face changed before a word was spoken. Somewhere inside the palace, one reaction began to harden into something more dangerous than disappointment. And before the royal household could understand the decision, it had to face the people wounded by it. Every inheritance carries money, but this one carried memory. For Charles, it was a final act of loyalty to the father, whose approval he had spent a lifetime trying to earn. For Anne, it was a command wrapped in grief. For William, it was a lesson in royal duty. And for Camilla, watching from the edge of the decision, it was a reminder that some doors in the family never fully opened. Charles looked at the confirmation again, but this time he was not reading it as king. He was reading it as a son. Prince Philip's private estate meant the late Duke's personal belongings, letters, records, and family items kept outside normal royal sharing. That mattered because these were not public treasures made for display. They were private pieces of a hard, disciplined life. To Charles, the estate carried Philip's final judgment about loyalty, silence, and service. It said who had understood him, it said who had endured him, and it said who could be trusted when emotion turned into pressure. Anne sat across from Charles without reaching for the paper. She had spent decades doing the work without demanding applause, and now that same quiet strength had brought her to the center of the storm. The Princess Royal, a title meaning the monarch's eldest daughter, had always carried duty like a shield. Anne had stood steady when others wanted attention. She had kept moving when others wanted praise. That was why Philip's choice felt so sharp. It did not reward noise. It rewarded endurance. Anne finally asked one question, and her voice carried more grief than surprise. "Are you certain this is what he wanted?" Charles did not answer quickly. He gave a small nod, the kind that closed every escape route. The king knew his sister was not asking for proof. She was asking whether their father's last trust had truly fallen on her alone. Anne lowered her eyes, not in weakness, but in acceptance. She understood that Philip had not left her comfort. He had left her responsibility. William studied the decision in silence, and the prince felt the weight of what it would do to the family. He respected Anne. He understood why Philip trusted her. But he also knew every royal decision creates a shadow, and this one would fall across people who believed they deserved a place inside that private legacy. William saw the strength in Charles's choice, yet he could already sense the pain coming toward them. Camilla learned the deeper details soon after, and the queen consort's expression changed when she heard what the estate included: private letters, restricted family records, personal items Philip had refused to place under wider palace control. A senior aide explained through a documented household account that Anne's authority prevented anyone else from opening, moving, or reassigning those holdings without her consent. Camilla heard the meaning beneath the words. Anne had not just inherited objects. She had inherited the power to say no. The wound deepened when one family member finally asked the question everyone feared. Why Anne, and no one else? And the answer to that question was buried in a moment the palace had tried to forget. Long before Charles confirmed the decision, one private moment had already sealed the future. It was not a public scandal, not a speech, not a ceremony watched by millions. It was a closed-door confrontation inside Windsor, where Prince Philip's final wishes were questioned, and Princess Anne did something no one else dared to do. She defended his private world as if she were guarding the man himself. Anne remembered the meeting because the air in that room had changed the second Philip's name was spoken, like a problem to be managed. The January estate meeting was a private family review, meaning a closed discussion where selected royals and advisors examined how a deceased family member's personal belongings should be handled. It mattered, because Philip's possessions were not only old letters, keepsakes, and records. They carried his private judgment. They held the habits of a man who believed duty should be quiet, controlled, and never used for personal gain. Charles sat through the early part of that meeting with a still face, but the king heard every word like a test. Advisors suggested dividing the late Duke's personal estate across several branches of the family to avoid future disputes. That sounded careful. It sounded practical. But Anne knew what it really meant. It meant Philip's private world could be broken into pieces for comfort, politics, and palace balance. The Princess Royal did not raise her voice. She did something colder. She placed her hand firmly over the folder. Camilla noticed the gesture, and the queen consort understood that Anne was not simply disagreeing. She was drawing a line. Then came the moment no one forgot. Camilla asked whether some items should be rebalanced for the king's household, a phrase meant to make the request sound calm and reasonable. But the word cut through the room. Anne pushed back her chair just enough for everyone to hear it. Then she said, "That is not what he wanted." Charles looked at his sister, and something in him shifted. He saw controlled fury in Anne, but he also saw grief. She was not protecting objects. She was protecting their father's dignity. Philip had lived by rules that often wounded the people closest to him, but he had also left behind a code. Anne understood that code without needing it explained. Charles understood it too, but in that moment, he realized his sister carried it more naturally than anyone else in the room. The documented account of that meeting later became the private source Charles returned to when he made the final confirmation. One aide wrote that Anne's sentence ended the discussion before the vote could begin. The king never forgot those words. Months later, when he named her sole heir, the decision did not come from nowhere. It came from that chair moving, that folder being covered, and that one sentence landing like a command. Once the January estate meeting was understood, the coming confrontation no longer felt sudden, it felt inevitable. Because when the truth finally surfaced, Anne was no longer just an heir. She was the wall Charles chose to build around Philip's memory. The first true confrontation did not happen in public. It happened in a private palace room, where the air turned sharp and every word landed like a strike. Charles had made his decision. Anne had accepted the burden. But Camilla wanted answers, and William knew the room was seconds away from breaking. What followed was not a discussion about inheritance. It was a battle over respect, memory, and power. Charles gathered Anne, William, and Camilla after the confirmation began moving through the senior household. The confirmation was the signed royal decision that made Anne the only person with full authority over Prince Philip's private estate. That mattered because once officials had seen it, the decision could not be treated as a family rumor or a passing emotion. It had weight, it had structure, it had the king's name behind it. Charles understood that if he softened now, the entire meaning of Philip's final wishes would collapse. Camilla did not wait long before asking the question that had been pressing against the room. Why should Anne alone hold power over items connected to the wider family? The queen consort kept her voice controlled, but the tightness beneath it was impossible to miss. She was not asking about one box or one letter. She was asking why a whole part of Philip's private world had been placed beyond everyone else's reach. Charles heard the wound beneath the words, yet he did not rush to comfort her. Anne remained still. She looked at Charles, then at Camilla, and her silence carried more force than anger. The Princess Royal did not defend herself because she did not believe trust needed an apology. Anne had spent a lifetime standing beside duty, without turning it into theater, and now that same silence became her answer. She had not demanded Philip's estate. She had been chosen to guard it. That difference mattered, and everyone in the room felt it. William stepped in carefully, knowing one careless sentence could split the family further. The prince said Philip valued duty over closeness, and the words changed the air. Charles looked down for a moment because William had named the truth no one wanted to hold. The late Duke had not measured love in comfort. He had measured it in discipline, loyalty, and restraint. William understood that, and so did Anne. Charles finally revealed through a recorded private conversation prepared for the household archive that Philip had left instructions for Anne to protect the estate from emotional bargaining. The king explained that the phrase meant no one could use hurt feelings, status, or family pressure to move the late Duke's private possessions. Camilla heard the words and went quiet. The queen consort understood then that this was not Charles favoring his sister. This was Charles obeying his father. The confrontation ended without peace. Camilla rose first, her face controlled but cold, and the room seemed to hold its breath as she left. Anne did not follow. William did not speak. Charles stayed where he was, knowing the door had closed on one argument and opened another. And once that door closed, the true power behind his decision began to reveal itself. The palace soon realized this was not just an inheritance, it was authority. Princess Anne had not simply been given Philip's private estate. She had been given the power to decide who could touch it, who could read it, who could enter its locked history, and who would be turned away. For a family built on hierarchy, that single detail was more shocking than the estate itself. Anne read the authority clause alone, and for the first time since Charles confirmed the decision, the full weight of it pressed against her. An authority clause meant the written part of a formal decision that explained exactly what power a person had and where that power ended. But this one did not feel like normal royal wording. It gave Anne sole control over Philip's private letters, personal collections, estate rooms, and protected family records. That mattered, because those records did not simply hold memories. They held choices, tensions, loyalties, and old truths the family had never wanted exposed. Charles framed the decision as preservation, not favoritism. The king told senior officials that Philip's private estate had to remain loyal to the late duke's original wishes, not reshaped to make others comfortable. Charles understood the danger. If the estate became a shared family matter, every item could become an argument. Every letter could become a weapon. Every room could become a battlefield. By placing Anne in control, he was not giving her power for pleasure. He was giving her power to stop the past from being pulled apart. Anne closed her eyes when she reached the final line. She had been chosen by her father's memory and confirmed by her brother's hand. That should have felt like honor. Instead, it felt like standing between Philip and everyone who might try to soften, explain, or use what he left behind. The Princess Royal did not fear responsibility, but even she knew this one was different. This was not a ribbon-cutting duty. This was a family lock, and she had been given the key. William later told Charles that the decision would be misunderstood. The prince chose his words carefully because he respected Anne, but he could see the storm forming around her. Charles listened, then admitted quietly that doing what is right often looks cruel before history understands it. The king knew people would call it harsh. He knew some would see rejection where Philip had meant protection. William understood then that his father had accepted the pain before signing the paper. A private inventory deepened the concern. The inventory was a written list of items kept in the estate, and this one named several sealed boxes marked for Anne's eyes only. One aide, speaking through a documented household account, realized what that meant. Anne now controlled access to material that could reshape private family narratives. Not public history, something more dangerous, family memory. The first consequence arrived faster than expected. A request came in to access part of the estate, and Anne's answer was simple, firm, and final. No. That denial turned a royal decision into a family fracture. Shock does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives in stillness. A chair left empty. A request unanswered. A face changing when a message is delivered. Inside the palace, the first signs of fallout were quiet but unmistakable. Anne's new authority was no longer theoretical. It had begun to affect who entered Philip's private world and who was kept outside it. Anne received the first formal request, with no surprise on her face. A formal request meant an official written appeal made through palace channels, asking for permission to review or move items connected to the estate. This one asked to examine several pieces from Philip's private collection for family placement, a soft phrase that meant certain belongings could be reassigned to other royal spaces. That mattered because once one item moved, others could follow. One exception could become a pattern. One open door could become an invitation for everyone to ask. Anne rejected it without drama. She did not raise her voice. She did not write a long explanation. The Princess Royal stated that nothing would be moved until she personally completed the estate review. That review meant her own careful check of Philip's private belongings, papers, and restricted family items before anyone else could touch them. Anne's answer was short, but it carried the full force of Charles's confirmation. No one could go around her. No one could pressure her through comfort, memory, or rank. Camilla received the answer while seated alone, and the queen consort's expression hardened before she said a word. She understood at once that Anne's control was not symbolic, it was real. The denied request involved a private military keepsake, a sealed correspondence box, and one personal item many believed would eventually belong to the king's household. Camilla had expected discussion. Instead, she was handed a boundary, and boundaries inside royal families can wound more deeply than open insults. Charles heard about the rejection soon after, and the king did not reverse it. That silence mattered. It proved to Anne that his confirmation had not been a ceremonial gesture, meaning a formal act done only for appearance. He had given her authority, and he intended to let her use it. Charles knew the decision would cause discomfort, but he also knew Philip had feared exactly this kind of emotional pulling after his death. If the king stepped in now, the whole promise would weaken. William understood the new line before others wanted to admit it. The prince saw that Anne's refusal had divided the family into two groups, those trusted by Philip's code and those kept outside it. William did not celebrate that truth. He felt the sadness of it. Philip's legacy was becoming a mirror, and not everyone liked what it showed. Resentment began to rise quietly, spreading through glances, messages, and unfinished conversations. Then Charles made one request of his own. He asked Anne to meet him privately, with no aides, no advisors, and no one to soften what had to be said. In that quiet meeting, the story finally stopped being about inheritance and became about grief. There were no advisors in the room this time, no courtiers, no official language to hide behind. Only Charles and Anne, two children of Prince Philip, sitting with the memory of a father who had shaped them in very different ways. The king had made the decision, but now he needed his sister to understand why. And Anne, for once, allowed the armor to crack. Charles asked for the private meeting after the fallout began to spread through the family. The confirmation had placed Anne at the center of tension, and the king knew she would never complain about it. A confirmation meant the formal approval that made his decision official, but this one carried more than procedure. It carried Philip's name, Philip's trust, and Philip's unfinished shadow. Charles understood why the moment mattered. If Anne felt abandoned after accepting the burden, then the decision meant nothing. If she stood alone, then he had failed both sister and father. Anne arrived prepared for duty, not comfort. She expected estate language, family pressure, maybe another difficult instruction. But Charles spoke first as a brother, not as the monarch. He admitted he had spent years trying to understand Philip's approval, chasing it in silence, hearing it in rare words, missing it in long pauses. The king did not dress the confession in royal strength. He said it plainly, and Anne looked at him with the kind of stillness that comes when old pain finally has a name. Anne answered softly, but the words cut deep. She said she never asked for Philip's approval. She simply tried to earn it. The Princess Royal did not say it with pride. She said it like someone remembering years of duty performed without applause, without reward, without anyone asking whether it cost her anything. Charles heard the truth in that. Anne had not competed for Philip's trust. She had carried it before anyone officially gave it to her. Charles then revealed, through a recorded private conversation prepared for the family archive, that Philip's instruction had not been only legal. A private instruction meant a personal direction left behind to guide the family after his death. This one included a message describing Anne as the keeper of what must not be traded. The king paused after saying it, because the phrase explained everything. Philip had not chosen Anne to win. He had chosen her to protect what others might bargain away. Anne's composure broke only for a moment. Her eyes lowered, her breath tightened, and the armor she had worn for years finally showed a crack. Then, the Princess Royal accepted the role fully. Not with triumph, not with satisfaction. She promised Charles that Philip's private estate would remain protected from vanity, rivalry, and revenge. Charles nodded, and for the first time since the confirmation, the room felt less like a battlefield. The king had not removed the pain, but he had named it. Anne had not escaped the burden, but she had accepted it with full knowledge of what it meant. Their private understanding gave the palace its first moment of stability. But beyond those closed doors, the outside world was waiting to judge the decision loudly. And when the story reached the public, the monarchy discovered that private grief could become national fascination overnight. By morning, the palace could no longer contain the shock. What began as a private royal confirmation became a national conversation about loyalty, inheritance, and who Prince Philip truly trusted. The public did not see boxes, clauses, or estate language. They saw something simpler and more powerful. Anne, the steady daughter, chosen above everyone else to guard the private legacy of a man who rarely gave praise. Charles watched the broadcast in silence, and every word seemed to tighten the space around him. The palace had released a controlled statement, meaning a carefully written public message designed to confirm the decision without exposing private family tension. It confirmed Anne's sole authority over Philip's private estate, but the careful language only made people more curious. That mattered because the monarchy survives on control, and this story had escaped control almost instantly. It was no longer just about inheritance. It was about character. Anne refused to respond publicly. The Princess Royal understood that any comment from her would turn duty into performance, and that was exactly what Philip would have disliked. But an aide noticed her pause when she saw her father's name across every headline. Anne did not show pride. She showed pain. The attention proved that Philip's trust had become public, but it also meant his private world was now being discussed by strangers. For Anne, that was the cruel cost of being chosen. A crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and one image captured the feeling better than any speech. A woman stood near the gates holding a handwritten sign that read, "Philip trusted Anne." Others stopped to look at it, and soon that simple sentence began to feel like the public verdict. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main official London residence, mattered in that moment because it turned a private family decision into something the nation could physically gather around. People were not only watching from home, they were arriving at the door of the monarchy itself. A major morning broadcaster opened with a line that cut through the noise. "This is not just an inheritance story. This is a judgment of character." The presenter repeated that the decision placed Anne in a rare position of personal trust, and royal commentators quickly framed it as one of the strongest signs of confidence ever given to the Princess Royal. Anne had spent years avoiding drama, and now her quiet service had become the center of it. Charles heard the praise, but the king also heard what it exposed. Public admiration for Anne carried an unspoken question about everyone else. Why her? Why not them? Why did Philip's final trust fall so clearly in one direction? Charles knew the answer, and that answer hurt. The late Duke had valued discipline above display, loyalty above noise, and service above comfort. Public feeling settled around Anne with surprising force. Camilla stayed silent. William stayed careful. Charles stayed firm. The palace began to understand that the verdict had already been delivered, not by officials, but by the emotional instinct of the people watching. What remained was not another argument, but the final meaning of Charles's choice. In the end, the shock faded, the whispers softened, and the meaning of the decision became impossible to deny. King Charles had not simply handed Princess Anne an estate. He had confirmed a truth the family had spent years circling. Prince Philip's deepest trust rested with the daughter, who asked for the least and carried the most. The palace was shaken because the decision was personal, final, and painfully honest. Charles understood that his confirmation had become more than a family decision. It had become a defining royal moment. The confirmation meant the formal approval that made Anne the sole heir to Philip's private estate, and that mattered because it turned private property into a symbol of trust. This was not entitlement. This was not comfort given because of rank. This was Philip's final judgment, protected by the king and accepted by the sister who had lived longest inside that old code of duty. Anne's sole inheritance proved something the monarchy rarely says out loud. Duty can be rewarded years after the world stops watching. The Princess Royal had spent a lifetime carrying responsibility without demanding softness in return, and now that silence had become the reason she was chosen. Anne did not look like someone who had won. She looked like someone who understood the cost. Philip's private estate remained under her protection, but the true revelation was already clear. His final trust had been selective, deliberate, and unshakable. Camilla had to accept the part no one could soften for her. Some corners of Philip's world were never hers to influence. The queen consort did not challenge the decision again, and her silence became the final sign of defeat. She had stood near the edge of the inheritance and discovered there was no path inside it. That did not make the moment loud. It made it colder, because sometimes the hardest royal rejection is not spoken. It is simply enforced. William saw the lesson with the eyes of a future king. The prince understood that monarchy survives not through comfort, but through difficult choices made without applause. He watched Charles carry the pain of obedience, and he watched Anne carry the burden of trust. William knew the decision would stay with him. One day, he too would have to choose between peace and principle, between pleasing the room and protecting what mattered. Charles' decision revealed his own surrender. The king had spent years trying to understand Philip, trying to soften old wounds, trying to make sense of a father who gave love through pressure more often than praise. But in the end, Charles stopped trying to reinterpret his father's wishes. He honored them exactly as they were. That was the quiet heartbreak beneath the royal firmness. The monarch did not choose the easiest path. He chose the honest one. Anne did not emerge as the victor in a family contest. She emerged as the guardian of Philip's private truth, chosen because she understood duty, without needing to turn it into power. There was no unresolved ending here. Charles made the decision, Anne accepted the burden, and Philip's legacy found its final keeper. This moment meant the monarchy had chosen memory over politics, loyalty over comfort, and trust over family pressure. For Charles, it was painful obedience to a father whose shadow never fully left him. For Anne, it was not a crown, not a reward, and not a public triumph. It was a sacred responsibility. And for the royal family, the message was unmistakable. Philip's private world would not be divided by ambition. It would be guarded by the one person he believed would never betray it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.